Welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. I'm Enda and I'm joined by my usual guests of Alan Morrison and Jaco James. On today's show, we're going to be looking back at Celtic's 3-1 win over 10-man Hibernian at the weekend. We're going to be talking about Liel Abada and his future at the club. And of course, we're going to be chatting about how Mikey Johnson is now the future of Celtic, now that he's lighting it up for the Republic of Ireland. Welcome along to the show. Welcome along to anybody who's watching on YouTube, and welcome along to anybody who's listening on podcast in the aftermath of this live stream. Alan, James, you're very welcome along. Alan, of course, Mikey Johnson. Like, there's talk about Liel Abada leaving the club. Mikey Johnson is there. He's ready to step up into that position, and he's ready to light it up.
Yes. Yeah. 20-minute cameo at home to Latvia, and it's all suddenly using new Liam Scales, right? So, listen, look, I think I said to you before the show, nothing I'd love more than for Celtic to have a first 11 of young Scottish, or Irish, or young Scottish local players, But unfortunately, that's not the way of modern football. Mikey Johnson's 23. He's been on loan in, I think it's Vitória Guimarães in Portugal all season. I think he's maybe started 8 games all season. He's declared for Republic of Ireland. He's obviously had a good 20 minutes against Latvia, as I said, so that's great for him. But, is he the future of Celtic? Listen, as I've said many times on this pod, Ange Postecoglou isn't a difficult person to read. He doesn't play funny games. Mikey Johnson's 23, he's out on loan for the season. He doesn't appear to have a future at Celtic, sadly. As much as he has some great moments and has got some magic twinkly feet, I just don't think there's the game intelligence there, the decision making, the final third impact that you need from somebody at that level, unfortunately. So, as with the other 10 or 11 players, whatever it is that are out on loan at the moment, I don't see any of them making a long-standing impact on the Celtic first team, unfortunately, including Mikey, sad to say.
Mm-hmm. If people don't know what I'm talking about, Mikey Johnson has switched allegiances from Scotland to the Republic of Ireland, and he made his debut for them against Latvia on Wednesday night. And he came off the bench, immediately made an impact, made a bursting run into the box, hit the post, and the deflection went into the rebound went into the net. And then just look up Mikey Johnson, Ireland, and you will see an amazing dribble from him about 20 minutes into his cameo for Ireland. It was absolutely phenomenal stuff, and I'm right back on the Mikey Johnson buzz for the rest of the year. So get used to listening to me talk about him. Unless, of course, he does absolutely nothing against France on Monday night, if he even plays against France.
No pressure.
I will be denouncing him as a fraud once more. Look, no, we're not going to talk about Mikey Johnson for the next hour. We're going to be talking about Celtic's win over Hibernian, and it was looking a little bit iffy at times at Celtic Park at the weekend. Celtic went 1-0 down, and then a couple of goals in the second half. Getting a goal and doing his own Georgios Giacomakis celebration. He's equally as ripped as the Greek was during his time at Celtic. And then Haksabanovic scoring his signature goal, cutting in off the left-hand side and curling it into the far corner. I'm not going to say it's like Arjen Robben playing on the right wing in his peak, but it's similar to that. Alan, general thoughts on the game, general thoughts on the win. It definitely wasn't a vintage Celtic performance, but I mean, there was a couple of, let's say, factors that you have to consider when you're considering the kind of performance that this was.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I suppose it was in some ways interesting that there was quite a bit of jeopardy in the game. Obviously, going a goal behind, even against 10 men. Hibs were very rigid, really, in their 5-3-1 sort of block, as they had been in their 5-4-1 block, actually. And Hibs are a decent passing team, actually. They've got some good footballers there. And I think Hanlon at the back is particularly good at delivering. The trademark long delivery on top of Greg Taylor's head, which, my goodness, did they try and milk that? I mean, every single time David Marshall got the ball, he simply launched it straight at Greg Taylor's head. But no, listen, so there's a bit of jeopardy in the game. It was a bit stuffy for a while. Celtic also got a penalty, got back into it. I think both penalties were absolutely fine. No issue with them. I mean, Starfelt. I mean, well, if you did something equivalent to that in your work, something as negligently stupid as that in your work. I mean, there are some jobs in life where if you were as equally negligently stupid in your job, somebody would lose a hand or an arm. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, what are you doing? If for 80 minutes he can be front foot, aggressive, win his headers, be incredibly difficult to get past. But almost every game he has a moment like that where he just does something like that. I mean, it was just so brainless. I mean, it was absolutely the right decision to give a penalty. Of course it was. But what do you say about an incident like that? It's just so frustrating.
I actually have to disagree with you here. I think that both the penalty calls were wrong, including the Cameron Carter-Vickers one. The Starfelt one, it's stupid, but it's incredibly, incredibly soft. Like, how many times out of 10 are you seeing that really given? Unless the player goes down, in which case it usually is called back. You're probably looking at maybe twice out of 10 that penalty is given on a regular basis. And then the Cameron Carter-Vickers one, he slips. There's contact, but he slips. That's for me, it wasn't a penalty for Celtic. And then the David Marshall one, when I watched that back again, and I burst out laughing that wasn't given as a penalty. I mean, it was absolutely as stonewall penalty as I've ever seen in my life. And you know what I'm like here? I don't like discussing penalties and decisions and refs and VAR, but it's unavoidable with this match, I think.
Well, that's fascinating. So the Yorkshire Whistler wouldn't agree with you. So on either of the two penalty decisions, I mean, to me, the Starfelt one, it's a bit like the other thing. This is going back to sort of grassroots and kids football coaching, that sort of thing. Is if you put your hands on someone's back, it's an easy decision to give. Similarly, if you can quite visibly see someone's shirt pulling away from their body, it's a simple decision to give. No one is going to complain about that, and that was very much it. With Carter-Vickers, I agree, but again, Hanlon's puts his arm around him. It's an easy decision to make. It's a dumb decision by Hanlon's part. And on the David Marshall one, Liel Abada literally falls over his own feet and crashes into David Marshall. He just loses his footing and falls flat on his face. It's just there's no way in the world that was a penalty. I don't know what you saw there. I mean, what caused Abada to fall over? He fell over literally, sort of 7 yards in front of David Marshall, and then careers into him because he's tripped over his own feet. What did David Marshall do to cause that situation?
He dived in.
Yeah, but Abada was already falling over. Yeah.
But it doesn't matter if a player's on the ground. If you slide in and hit a player on the ground, it's still a foul.
I think if you've fallen over, it's kind of all bets are off in that sense. You know what I mean? David Marshall's sliding in on the assumption he's going to tackle somebody with the ball. If that person then falls over, you know what I mean? It's not David Marshall's fault. The falling over happened before the Marshall slide.
Yeah, the two things I'll add is on the Starfelt penalty. To me, people were saying, well, if you call a shirt grab a penalty, it's going to happen every corner. To Alan's point, it wasn't just a shirt grab. It was a grab. The guy moved away. He held it as he moved away, and it looked like a tent coming off of the guy. So it was the duration and the obviousness of it that I think, made it pretty much Stonewaller, in my opinion, again. And again, you get people bunker down into their camps on Starfelt because he's one that still kind of, I think, splits the support from an opinion perspective. So again, this is where we have some statistics to try and offer some measure of where things land in reality. And this is league games so it's 54 and a half 90-minute periods. So that's all league games he's been in since he's been at Celtic. If you benchmark him across all of the leagues that StatsBomb covers, he's in the 21st percentile in errors, right? So that means, 100th percentile is good. 21st percentile is not good. And as Alan has pointed out, actually a disproportionate amount of his errors has been in cup games. That's where he's had some real shockers, and that's not even in that. So that's mostly in games where Celtic are completely dominating, steamrolling people in an era under Ange where, other than those first maybe, and again, some of that he front loaded, he had a rough couple of games. But again, even if you account for that, you back that out, you're still talking, not great. As far as committing those kind of errors. And that's not even talking about all the balls that he gives away. Again, that Alan's talked about, where he just 1 or 2 times a game, he seems to just have one of those passes where it's, inexplicable to a pressing member of the opposition.
I wonder, does the type of team that Celtic are in comparison to the league, does that play into how far up he is on the error list? Because if you think about the way that think of it from a goalkeeping situation. So Joe Hart, for example, doesn't face that many shots. So do you want him to be a better shot stopper, or do you want him to be better on the ball? Is it like a weighing thing that Celtic are doing here with Starfelt that,
No,
he's actually pretty decent?
Yeah, let me read the definition of what the metric is. How many errors the player makes per 90 minutes. An error is an on-the-ball mistake that led to a shot, right? So you this would actually be the opposite of that, Enda, meaning that because Celtic are so rarely defending in their own third in the league, a lot of his errors, and actually he's been very good in possession and, generally speaking in the attacking half, I think he's come on and made vast improvements to his credit. So this is purely, more central to our box and making errors that result in a shot by the opposition. So all of that makes that metric, I would argue, even
worse.
Oh my God, way worse, because there's so few times.
I've got it backwards. Yeah. So if you're dominating a game, your defender should be making way less errors, really.
It's a bit like saying, on Stats, well, a lot of people make the mistake of saying, I'm not right. I say Ryan Kent. I'm not going to just pick on Ryan Kent or Jota. Oh, look, they're in the 98th percentile for dribbles completed. Well, of course they fucking are. They're playing for the 2 most dominant teams in the league. So in that context, it's actually meaningless, really. If you were a Premier League side looking, should I buy Kent or should I buy Jota? Well, they're both 98%. They're the same. It's meaningless. It's absolutely, literally meaningless in that context. And this is one of those. This is what James is saying, absolutely spot on. He should be near the top of that list simply because he doesn't have to do a lot of defending. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a comment coming from Richie, who says that it's about concentration. He loses his concentration at some point during the match every game, and I do agree with that. I do think there are moments where he does lose his concentration. And again, I'm sorry for all the international talk, but it is an international week. But last night when Ireland were leading Latvia 2-0, they got very, very comfortable in the game, and the 3 defenders, Andrew Omabamidele, Dara O'Shea, and
Collins.
God, I'm having a brain fart here now. But the third defense, they were very, very Nathan Collins. Yes, they were very, very lax in possession. They're 3 very good ball playing defenders, but they were very lax in possession. They were making stupid errors. They were losing the ball. They were being dispossessed. They were giving the ball away. And Ray Houghton, who was on commentary, said that sometimes the game is just too easy, and defenders in these situations in ball playing games can just completely forget about what their main objective is, and that's being solid in defense and not doing anything stupid. And maybe that's what's happening with Starfelt here, is that Celtic is just so dominant that his concentration does go out the window every now and again.
It's partly that. It's also the other aspect. I think that probably accounts for some of his errors. A lot of his errors are down to just being. It's the nature of how he defends. He's very aggressive and he's very front foot. So those are 2 very positively loaded terms I've just used there. But the downside to being a defender that plays that way is that sometimes you can get caught under the ball, which he does, and sometimes you can try and win headers or win challenges that you cannot win, and sometimes you just have to let the attacker get the ball, physically put pressure on them, and then just defend from there, rather than thinking you can intercept it or get your leg round or get your head in front of them or whatever it is. And he's the sort of defender I don't like, because he's over optimistic. He always thinks he can impact the game, I like defenders that are incredibly pessimistic. They always think, what's the worst that can happen? And I will position myself to mitigate that. And then if it doesn't happen, it's fine. If it does, I'm prepared for it. He always expects to win the ball. And when he doesn't, it generally means he's then putting other people in a very difficult situation. So it might be like this. Sorry.
So again, let me just put a little bit more context on this. So if you this is only a little over 7 games minutes wise, and 90-minute equivalents was in the Europa League last season. So it includes Jablonec and the Alkmaar qualifying games, as well as I think he ended up hurt and he didn't play all of the group games, but I think he had like 3 games he played in the group. So his error rate was in the first percentile. So, and it was 4 times worse than it is in his tenure in the league. So again, and then we've got that, and that's what we have measurable. That's not even counting the cup games where, again, he's had some issues. So the weight of the evidence at this point, I think it's difficult to argue. The sample size is large enough across the different competitions, I think, that, playing at Celtic in this system, just generally for whatever reason, and Alan's more of an expert on an explanation on some of the technical aspects, obviously, that, he is prone to errors. It's just, it's hard to argue and get away from that. And at a rate that's significant. It's not insignificant.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of a former Liverpool partnership in defence in Virgil van Dijk and Dejan Lovren, because Dejan Lovren is very similar to Kar Starfelt in that he's an aggressive front-footed defender who, jumps into tackles, goes for headers, and that doesn't necessarily make him a bad defender, but it does make him much more prone to making errors and misjudging a tackle and getting caught out in the ball and potentially overestimating his ability on the ball at times as well. And then you put him beside Virgil van Dijk, who's just the complete opposite of that, and he's so composed, barely puts a foot wrong. Well, he did at the time when they was playing beside Lovren, and he's just the complete opposite to what they are. And if you put Cameron Carter-Vickers beside Kar Starfelt, who very, very rarely does anything wrong, then Starfelt's mistakes are going to look far worse because Cameron Carter-Vickers would not make that same mistake. I think it's definitely some of this is a little bit of perception.
Well, and also there's a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy in that it's overwhelmingly the case that, as I sort of joked about with David Marshall launching long balls badly on top of Greg Taylor's head, is that virtually every team in the league, even in the League Cup final against the Rangers, every team in the league launches long balls onto Greg Taylor or Starfelt, because for that very reason, that is the weakest part of Celtic's team. And therefore, there is more opportunity to make errors. I mean, they don't bother launching long balls at Johnston and Carter-Vickers because what's the point? They're very rarely going to make a mistake, but then they have relatively less defending to do. And so they're going to make less mistakes, right? So there's a little bit of that you have to factor in as well, is that, just by the fact that they've got so much more defending to do. And I think StatsBomb had quite a nice graphic, which I think I shared in the week, was showing the areas that Celtic have to defend in. And the sort of, it was like color coded. So red meant lots of activity and dark blue or black meant, just like the sea of calm. And, the Carter-Vickers area was just like, there is no wind, there is no tide, there is nothing happening here at all. And then, the sort of Starfelt Taylor area is kind of bright red, flashing lights sort of thing. It was very, very much like that.
Yeah. The title of this live stream is Jota on the wing, Abada out the door, I think, something like that. So we're going to be chatting about Liel Abada and his contract situation later on. But just to finish on the Hibs win, one of the standout players on this game was definitely Jota, Alan, and you've been writing about him during the week on your site, Celtic by Numbers. There's been a frustration around Jota in games so far in probably this calendar year, 2023 at least, that maybe his dribbling isn't being as successful as previous has been, or he hasn't been at the forefront of what Celtic have been doing in attack. But in this game, he was involved in practically everything good the Celtic did going forward.
Yeah. Well, as we've said many times, is what you get with Jota is you get a lot. You get a lot of everything. So you get a lot of crosses. you get a lot of shots, you get a lot of running with the ball, you get a lot of on the ball action. He's not one that, like Maeda, where you have to kind of manipulate him into the game. Or with Maeda, for example, when he gets the ball, unless he can directly run past the defender, he's just really going to recycle it. With Jota, you're always going to see him try to do something. Now that has pros and cons, because sometimes a lot of the time it's not going to come off. Okay, so a lot of crosses are going to get flashed across and no one's going to be on the end of them. A lot of shots from outside the box are going to fly over the bar, etc. A lot of dribbles are going to end up going nowhere, right? But what he does have is he has a sort of indefatigable optimism. So this is exactly what I was saying about Starfelt, right? What I want to see in my wingers and my strikers is unquenchable reservoirs of optimism, as in, if I go at this guy and I get tackled, or I run the ball out of play, I get the ball next time and I do it again and I do it again. And if I'm a striker, I keep making, like Kyogo, I've made 20 runs, I've not had a sniff of the ball, but I go again and I go again. That's what you want from your attacking players. You want that optimism that it only takes that one time for it to come off and you've changed the game. That's what you need. So he does that, right? But what we've seen this season is quite a drop-off, really. If you just look at the most basic metrics of expected goals, expected assists. So last season, his average over 90 minutes expected goals, expected assists was 0.84. So that's 0.84 expected goals or assists per 90 minutes, which is, for a wide player, is fantastic. This season, it was down at about 0.6, 0.7 before he got injured in October, and it dropped down to 0.5. Since he's come back from that injury. I don't know if that's related, because he wasn't out for a long time. So I don't know if it was the injury, but it seemed to me like he seemed to have lost a yard of pace. I don't know if that's just one of these perception things that you have, that I've arrived at that conclusion because his numbers aren't great, therefore I've concluded he's lost a yard of pace, but he just didn't look as quick to me. I don't know if his confidence was eroded. I don't know. I honestly don't know what the reason for it is, but there's no doubting to me that his performance levels have dropped off. But what we've seen in the last two games at Hearts in the Cup, and then on Saturday against Hibs, is a return to that Jota that we know and love from last season, which is just an absolute volume monster. Just ridiculous number of things that he is doing. I mean, some of the stats were crazy. I mean, he had 16 touches in the box. Well, his previous high all season would have been 10. He had. He lost the ball 21 times, right? So, I mean, losing the ball, you might think it's not a good thing, but it means he's trying things. He's trying to be creative. The previous high in the season would have been, 17. He had over 2.1 expected goals and assists. Now, I know you've got to take a penalty out of that, obviously, which is, by the way, an absolutely awful penalty. But, so you've got to factor that in. But still, his expected goals, expected assists in the last two games have been up and beyond even last season. So it looks like, hopefully, 2 games in a row. I don't know, is that a trend? Is that significant? But at least there's signs there that he's getting back to the player that was pretty consistent last season. To be fair to him, pretty consistent. Yeah. My last word on Jota is that I did an analysis where I was trying to work out a very, and James will shoot me down here for doing sort of bad stats, but what I was trying to do was to sort of say, can we quantify how much harder the Champions League is to the Scottish Premier League? And what I very crudely worked out was that most players' stats, and this is only over 6 games, remember, so it's a really small sample, so this is why it's probably one reason why it's bad stats. But in general, most players' productivity from an attacking perspective dropped between about 30 and 40%. And the player whose productivity dropped the least at Champions League level was Jota. Which led me to say that even if you disagree with the numbers, the trend I think is reasonable. Is that he was the one player that got close to being at the level and maintaining his level of performance at that. Now, whether that took it out of him or whether he just couldn't recapture that after that Champions League campaign, I don't know. But as I say, last 2 games, hopefully we're starting to see him get back to that level.
Well, before we touch on Jota, because I think you've raised a very interesting point there, Alan. I just want to go back to something that you said there. There's only actually 2 types of penalties: a good penalty which goes in and a bad penalty that does not go in. So Jotas went in. It's a good penalty. It's fine. That's all that matters. But no, James, Alan, really, that's a really interesting point that Alan's raised about this. It's pretty much about the scalability of talent within the Celtic squad. Now, we've spoken about scaling up the game plan and things like that. But if you look at the Celtic squad over the last number of years, like Juranovic, for example, would have been the player that you picked out as, you know, he made a couple of mistakes in the Champions League, yes, but his quality and his skills scale up to a higher level. He stands out as the player most likely to bring it up to another level, and he has done that in the Bundesliga. Frimpong, you know, left and has done the same with Bayer Leverkusen, albeit as a right winger as opposed to a right back that Celtic were playing him in. Jota is another one of those players that you look at the overall quality of the team, and yes, there are players who have been really important for us and really good in the Scottish League, but you do look at them as potentially having a ceiling that is below Champions League level, whereas I think Jota is definitely one of those players. He's still young, he's got skill, he's got the ability, where you think, yeah, he's probably the most likely to scale it up to another level beyond what he's currently doing.
Yeah, I think that I agree. I think it also makes sense relative to pedigree, and that I believe, I mean, it's nip and tuck with CCV, but I think he's right there as far as the most expensive player. So again, if you think of his age, the amount of money that was spent on him, the fact that he came through Benfica, I mean, that all kind of adds up that you would expect him to be at that kind of upper tier. But yeah, and his attacking, he had a good attacking Champions League, and what I would say is he seemed up for it. I mean, that he seemed like someone who responded to the challenge and, you know, the platform. You know, someone excited to kind of show what they can do, and so I think in the league this year he's averaging like 3 1/3 dribbles, and it was only 3 games that he had in the Champions League minutes wise. I'm assuming that was because of subs. But so 3.3 90-minute blocks. He averaged 5.4 dribbles. So again, that's an idea. You know, we didn't have anywhere near the amount of ball that we would domestically, and yet he was still taking players on very aggressively, kind of front-footed. My concern's been and continues to be how he fits relative to Celtic's kind of defensive setup, and how effective he can be at the Champions League level relative to kind of implementing the game plan that Ange has for the defensive setup. But and I think that was also reflected in the Champions League, is a lot of his metrics weren't great there. But yeah, he should be able to attack and perform at that level creatively, and so far so good, because he did it last year in the Europa League, again, even against Leverkusen and Betis. So there's certainly, you know, it wasn't just the Champions League this year. He's building up kind of a portfolio of performing at that level. Yeah.
So before we move on to Liel Abada, who's been in the news for probably the wrong reasons in Celtic's head, anything you just want to touch on before we move on from the Hibs game?
No, I just, it's almost becoming comical now how predictable everyone's setup is. that was going to be my opening joke. Enda, what shape do you think Hibs are in for the game? You know,
well, it's also like it's becoming so predictable how the games have been going as well with that system. Like, it got to the point where, because I didn't watch the game live, I watched it back, and I got the notification for Hibs scoring first, and it didn't even move me. I kind of just shrugged my shoulders and went, it doesn't really mean anything. Celtic are going to come back in the game, and they did. And like, fair enough. You watch the game back and you're like, okay, that was actually closer than it seemed. But in the same way that the last couple of weeks where Celtic haven't been the team that scored first, it just doesn't move me. I'm just like, Celtic are going to bring on the cavalry, and they'll blow them away in the last 30 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to Alan's point, he's referenced earlier. I mean, as far as non-Rangers domestic teams, they're probably the best as far as passing. So, you know, of those that try to play out a little bit from the back, they're the ones most equipped to do it. And when they blended that with, pretty well organized pressing setup before the red card, they were making it uncomfortable to a degree. But even if they hadn't had the guys sent off, the expectation, I think the reasonable one, is that they probably would have ran out of gas like most teams do. And then, maybe we pull back 2-1 instead of 3-1, that kind of thing. But the other thing that has to be said, I mean, Marshall is still a decent shot stopper. He's uneven. He's got some inconsistency issues there. And that's been at least as far back as 15, 16, when I looked at him a while. This is a couple of years ago, even before he came back to Scotland. He's very uneven in his shot stopping. So, he's capable of those games where he pulls off a handful of really, really great saves, but he's also, vulnerable to, I don't know if it's lapse of concentration or whatever, but some rough games. So, yeah, I mean, he, that could have very easily have been a couple more goals had he not had a pretty decent shot stopping game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the post shot XG was about 3.2, and he conceded 3. So he did 7 saves. He did okay. I think it's fair enough. I mean, other notable stats, and just a couple of chuck in. I mean, Kyogo had I think 7 shots at goal and completed 6 passes, and this is pretty typical. More touches in the box than passes, more shots at goal than passes. I used to joke about Lee Griffiths being like that, but this is like another level to that. He's just there to score goals. That's all he needs to do. And then another. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say I'm absolutely okay with that as well.
Yeah. It's the team instruction versus fit of the individual to do the job being asked of them. And then just another Abada was. We're going to move on to Abada, so maybe we'll segue on that one. But Alistair Johnson, another plus 100 packing performance from him. Jota led the way in that regard, 170. Johnson was next, 137, and then third was Abada on 105. So a nice little cameo there, and that may segue to the next topic.
Yeah, so we'll talk about Liel Abada then, because that was the news that dominated the Celtic sphere over the last number of days. The rumors are that he has rejected a new contract with Celtic. Now, I say this with a strong asterisk because I don't believe that there's smoke without fire in a large amount of these cases. But if you think about the amount of times that Celtic or a Celtic player has been linked with not signing a new contract, and then a month goes down and he signs a new contract, like it happens all the time. It's a negotiation tactic a large amount of the time. There's agents work at play a large amount of the time, probably 95 to 99% of the time it's agent work. And these stories don't get out to the press out of nowhere. So that's the asterisk that I'll put beside this. But James, assuming this is true, assuming Liel Abada has not signed a new contract, I mean, it kind of makes total sense in a way. If there's one player in the team that I was going to pick out that I would say is probably not going to sign a new contract, is Liel Abada, because he has 3 years left on his current deal. He's a young player who's playing international football, who's played Champions League football, who scored in big games for Celtic and was linked with moves away last summer. He's going to be linked with moves away this summer. If I'm his agent, I'm saying, no, you're absolutely not signing another 2 to 3 year deal with Celtic, because they're not going to pay you enough and somebody else will pay you that amount of money.
Yeah, and if my memory serves, I think he changed agents not too long ago too. I think I'd read that somewhere, which again is something that oftentimes happens when people are making career shifts in sports. Players seek out a different kind of agent for a different purpose. So yeah, I've talked about that this coming summer. Now, I think his playing time generally, he's made a lot of appearances. He's played a lot of minutes, but he hasn't started as much this season. So from a profile perspective, that's probably less than ideal going into trying to shop him this summer. But just from a 2 seasons, young player, plays very well, posts eye-watering statistics, puts their 2 seasons in, sell them. Like that should be just generically, the timeline. Now he was on the younger end of that, spectrum, coming in at 19, and I think he'll be 22 later this year. So I wouldn't be upset if he stayed one more year, obviously, but if the player wants to go, as Alan has said many times, that that's it, you're either all in or you're not in at all. And so yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense for everybody involved, assuming that the club are able to attract a fee that's reasonable. And this is where it's interesting. I think he's a classic example of where I suspect you'll get a pretty big fracture in the market, meaning that clubs that are more traditional in their scouting approach, because he's such an eyesore at times, people are just going to say, no way, this guy's not even any good. And then, I'm being hyperbolic there, but the flip side of that is people that are using more advanced statistics, so that he'll hit screens, he'll hit things, and then again, if they're a little bit more nuanced in how they look at things, so I think I think it'll say a lot about who ends up signing him. I wouldn't be surprised if it's somebody even on the continent, not necessarily in England. I would be surprised to see him to go somewhere in France or in Italy, like an Atalanta type. I'm not saying Atalanta, but somebody like that who's a little bit more forward thinking on analyzing players, because he's not a straightforward, simple case. There is nuance to his profile, let's call it.
Yeah, well, there's a comment in here that says that Abada running with the ball looks like Bambi trying to walk for the first time. And another person says that he's very wasteful, that they wouldn't want a winger who can't cross in their team. Alan, I think this depends on your definition of wasteful, because on the ball and facing frontwards towards a player, or with loads of time to dribble at someone, Abada is an incredibly wasteful player. But in a split-second decision at the back of the post to fire the ball into the net, he is incredibly lethal.
So I did a bit of a deep dive into Abada in terms of the question I was trying to answer for myself, or for the article I was writing for myself, was, probably nobody will read it, is, has he improved over last season? And that's just a really very simple apples for apples comparison of key attacking metrics from last season versus this. And one thing I'm very aware that we probably need to start doing, James does it better than I, in terms of context to what we're saying, is, I'm using my own data. Okay, so why is that important? Well, one of the reasons it's important is because it is apples for apples. So it's the same data set every year. The second thing is I cover all games. So I cover Champions League, League Cup, FA Cup, Scottish Cup, whatever, league games, etc. A lot of providers don't do the League Cup or the Scottish Cup, or they'll split out Champions League and SPFL, and you can't get a unified view. And again, I'm just trying to explain to the listeners that this is the case. So because there's increasing number of people using data, and because there's an increasing number of sources of data, and I think I feel responsible to sort of explain, therefore, what data am I talking about? Because I think it's important. James always says StatsBomb says this, or Y-Scout says this, and usually that comes with a caveat of StatsBomb says this, but it's for the SPFL only, or StatsBomb says this, but it's for the Champions League only. Okay, so when I'm talking about my own data, I'm talking about everything, all in, all competitions, everything in one big bucket. Okay, so the Champions League stuff's all munged in with everything else. Okay, so anyway, sorry, that's boring for people, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. So anyway, back to Abada. So a couple of things I want to cover really. One is just his performance in terms of this season versus last, and then I want to move on to a sort of broader discussion about Celtic's approach to what they're doing with Abada and this contract offer, if indeed that's what happened. So the comparison of Abada's data from last season to this was frankly stunning to me, and I often say that because it was just an incredible level of improvement across virtually every single attacking metric you can think of. And indeed, if I look at the metrics where his output is worse than last season, you could almost argue that's a positive. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, for example, he loses the ball more in the final third. So when we're looking at Celtic players, as I probably have said many times now, it's almost impossible now. You've got to really look at it and try and work out how much of what I am seeing is down to the individual abilities of the player, and how much of what I am seeing is down to the extraordinary levels of cohesion that the team is playing under. It's such a strong system of play that Postecoglou has implemented that you can absorb Starfelt and his brain farts. You can absorb Abada running into a player and just falling over. You can absorb, Greg Taylor launching it 50 yards out of play. You can absorb all those things because the system is so strong. So it's almost as if the way that Celtic are playing makes there's an uplift almost that you could apply to every player based on how strong the system is. Having said all that, Abada's numbers are still remarkable in terms of the consistent, and I'm not talking about 1 or 2 percentage points improvements in things like the number of shots he's taking in the box, his XG per shot, number of big chances he's getting on the end of, the number of touches in the box, the number of crosses that he's being successful with, yes, that, the number of chances he's creating, his expected assists, number of passes he's putting into the danger zone. I'm not talking about 1 or 2%. I'm talking an average of 30 to 40% improvement across all of those metrics, all of them, right? That's extraordinary. Now, it may not be obvious to us because he's not starting. He's only started 8 games. And what we have to say, in fairness, for context, is number one, what I've just said about just the sheer efficiency of Celtic's attack now means that these attacking metrics for everyone are probably improved. But also number two, because Abada is coming on as a substitute, mostly as a substitute, he's getting that dividend that I've spoken about where Celtic are absolutely killing teams in the last 20 minutes. And everyone who comes on as a sub is racking up magical numbers because the opposition are knackered and the players that they're replacing are no worse or better than the players that are coming on. So put all that on the table, right? I would still suggest that here's a player who already had stats that would put him in the top 5 under 21 players in Europe for attacking threat. Already, he's now improved by a significant percentage points on that. So for me, I would want to keep this player. I really would want to keep this player. Okay. So then we come down to what are Celtic trying to do? Why are Celtic offering somebody with 3 years left on their contract a new contract, knowing that the way that the manager operates is if he refuses that contract, he's essentially out the door. So essentially you're playing. I don't know what the game is, Jeopardy or whatever. Because what are the outcomes here? The outcomes are he signs a new contract and we carry on as we were, or he doesn't, and suddenly he's pretty much out. He's out because there is no grey area here with Postecoglou. So I don't necessarily, I get that in some respects, and I don't get it in others. But I'll just sort of throw it out there for maybe get your guys' perspective on that.
Well, I think it's a pure numbers game, really, because the longer the contract, the harder it is for clubs to snatch him for relatively cheap, or for him to say, you know what, I've actually only got 1.5 years left in this contract. I'll stay 1 more year and then I'm gone. But also, I think it's a forward planning thing, because if Celtic know that they might get, 500,000 to 1 million extra on Abada this summer because of the 3 years that he has left on his contract, and immediately he's not willing to sign a new contract, then they can plan for this summer that, you know what, Abada's not going to be here. We're going to sell him and we're going to need to fill this position. I think it's pure forward planning, in my opinion. And it feels weird. I know it does. I know it's a weird and strange time that we're living in at Celtic, where a player doesn't want to be here, they're gone. Or a player or position needs to be filled, it's filled 6 months before that position becomes critical for Celtic. I think that's what this is. I think it's just, I wouldn't be surprised if Ange was the one who was pushing this, that, you know what, it might be better to get him out this summer. Let's put the feelers out. Let's see what the contract situation is like. And if we can keep him, great. he's got good numbers, but if he doesn't want to be here and if we can't afford him, then we need to be looking into that position immediately as somewhere to look at it. And this is the final point that it could be, is that maybe it's not this summer, maybe it's next summer, because the best and most successful clubs aren't operating on a summer by summer basis. They're operating on a by summer or even a try summer basis, where they have their signing identified for the next year's summer transfer activity. And I wouldn't put it past Ange to be that forward thinking in that, okay, we might not sell Abada this summer, even if he doesn't sign a new contract, he still has 3 years. Next summer or next Christmas, he's gone, and we have already got our replacement lined up, and we've spoken to the player, we've spoken to the club, we've spoken to the agent. Maybe it's another player coming in from the Asian markets where we can bring them in January, and it's already done before Abada leaves. Like that potentially could be it as well. So, James, what's your general thoughts?
Yeah, I think the again, the thing I key off of is the fact that the agent changed. So to me, that suggests that the player may want to leave. For whatever reason. People, these are human beings. So maybe he's, I don't know what his personal circumstances are. Maybe he's starting a young family, or maybe he wants to be closer to home for when he's got breaks, so he can get back easier. Who knows? Maybe he hates the weather. Shocker. I'm sure there's nobody that has that happen to him when they play in Scotland. So yeah, I suspect that's probably that. If I had to guess, that would be my guess, is that the players decided that he's ready to go, and doing it in a professional way, giving the team plenty of time. Everyone's kind of organized here. You know what I mean? There's professional ways to go about this, where you don't go in the huff and become a problem. You still do your job. You're still a professional. And Celtic gets a fair market value for him. And, again, this is how the model should be working. Whether it's this summer or next summer, I think there's reasonable, ideal debate from a Celtic perspective. But again, if he wants to go, then I think that, pretty much seals the fate, given all that we know about the Ange tenure, that it's going to be this summer.
Yeah, and I don't hold that against him. He's had a couple of good seasons at Celtic. He's played in the Champions League. He scored important goals for Celtic against Rangers. And he's a young guy who's he's probably not earning as much as he will potentially in the future at Celtic, and probably, will reach a certain plateau in his career that might not be able to progress any further than that. So, I mean,
and he's not one of those.
His job, and
he's one of those players where it's never even entered my mind remotely that he's coasting during a game. Like he's
no, I mean, he looked good.
I'm saying he's balls
when he came on at the weekend,
all the time, right? So he's not someone who looks like he's upset because he's still there, or not putting forth 100% effort. So I haven't been able to say any change in his body language, or not that I'm looking that close, but you know what I mean. But some of those times, players, in Cham showed that quite a bit for quite some time, and other players in the 2021 season, you could tell, when people aren't happy, and so it looks to me like this is all kind of working the way it probably should.
Yeah, and Cham's just French, so they all kind of look like that at some point in time, even when they're quite happy.
This is you just being bitter ahead of time for the game this week.
Just to finish then on the Abada situation, James, the Celtic fans, including me, will be saying we should not be selling him for any less than 10 to 15 million. What's your objective opinion on what Celtic will actually get for him? Because I know you generally tend to be closer than us fanfares.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking because of the duration of his contract, 8 to 10 would kind of be my guesstimate. Just because he is a nuanced player, and the teams that are more likely to be attracted to him are more likely to be the ruthlessly efficient type that aren't, going to overpay. So the ideal situation is when, you've got the the dumb money on the other side that you can overcharge for somebody that's actually not that good. And I don't think that's the case here. I actually, I would think that it's probably the opposite of that. So we're more likely, and again, these are just examples. I'm not saying he's going to go to these clubs, but he's more likely to be a Brentford or a Brighton or an Atalanta. And there's those kind of clubs in Belgium now and in Holland. So, you know, they're not just in the big league. So could a good, smart, you know, could Alkmaar come in and pay 8 million for Abada? Like that's the kind of situation that I would think would be more likely than, you know, him going for 20 million to Southampton or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Celtic paid around 3 million for him at the time when he came in. So
something like that, yeah.
10 to 12, I think, would be a reasonable return on your investment when it comes to a player that age. Since most people thought he was another's Fed written all over him, I think reasonably successful career at Celtic. And I mean, Celtic haven't sold him yet. I'm acting as if he's already out the door, but if he does end up leaving, I don't really see any issue with it majorly. Anything else you just want to touch on before we finish up the pod for the week? It's the week before the big week, essentially, if Celtic win next week, then that could be it.
That could be it. We get to get geared up for that again. It's like we're on a hamster wheel. These are coming fast and furious now.
Anything for you, Alan?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered everything on my list. Thank you.
Okay. Well, in that case, we will wrap the show up for another week. We will be back next week with a review of the Ross County game at the weekend, and then we'll also probably try fit in a preview at some point as well over the next couple of weeks for the big game against Rangers coming up. I'm not sure when that is. That is the 8th of April. So how many weeks is that away? Is it?
8th. I think it's the 8th. Isn't
That's
it?
right. That's the week after. Right.
So yeah, it's an international week this week, and then we've got Ross County up next, and then we will have Rangers after that. So the international week has kind of thrown me off keel a little bit. I like to base my weeks around the weekend football, and when international football comes in, it just throws me off completely. So
well, the combination of that, your Mikey Johnston lust, and then your hatred for France, all in 1 week. I mean, this is a lot for you.
Yeah. Well, somebody actually said in the comments that the thing that they fear most is the fact that Celtic will sell Liel Abada and bring in nobody, and Mikey Johnson will be there next week. And he's saying that as if it's a bad thing. If it's a bad thing.
And you'd literally never mentioned Mikey Johnson at any point in your life until the last week.
He's a new Liam Scales, some will say. And yes, I will be annoying people on this podcast.
I agree with that.
With my Mikey Johnson watch over the next couple of weeks. Alan, James, thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.
And thanks to everybody who watched in the comments as well. This will be available on podcast as well on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast if you want to listen back to it in full. Or you can get it on the YouTube channel as well. Just subscribe to the channel and get notified when we go live. We will be back again next week or the week after, whenever we can. And we'll let you know on Twitter, and we'll chat to you then.